Welcome to Paranormal Pages. Let's get straight into the True Scary Stories compilation. Story 1. The Whispering Swing. Every night, it begins the same way. Just as the clock strikes midnight, I hear a faint, eerie voice drifting through the night air. It's the voice of a child, soft and melodic, singing nursery rhymes with a haunting lilt. My name is Daniel, and I recently moved into this old Victorian house, nestled in the outskirts of a small, sleepy town. It seemed like the perfect place to escape the chaos of city life. Little did I know, the peace I sought would be shattered by the unsettling events that began to unfold. The first time I heard the voice, I dismissed it as a trick of the wind or perhaps the distant echo of a child's late-night game. But as the days turned into weeks, the nightly serenade persisted, growing clearer and more chilling with each passing night. The song would start with a gentle hum, then gradually morph into the familiar verses of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star or Rockabye Baby, each note dripping with an inexplicable sadness. Determined to uncover the source, I peered out of my bedroom window one night, hoping to catch a glimpse of the mysterious singer. The moonlight cast long shadows across the overgrown garden, but there was no sign of anyone. Just the old swing, suspended from an ancient oak tree, swaying gently as if pushed by an invisible hand. My heart pounded in my chest as I strained to see through the darkness, but the yard remained empty, silent except for the whispering song. "Who's out there?" I called, my voice breaking the stillness. No response came, only the continuation of the eerie melody. I shivered, retreating back into the safety of my room, but the song followed me, its presence almost tangible. It felt as if the walls themselves were closing in, echoing the ghostly lullaby. The next morning, I spoke with my neighbor, Mrs. Collins, an elderly woman who had lived in the area for decades. When I mentioned the singing, her face paled, and she glanced nervously at the old swing. "You mustn't pay attention to that," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's been there since the accident." "What accident?" I pressed, sensing there was more to the story. "A little girl lived here many years ago," she began, her eyes distant. "She loved that swing more than anything. But one day, something terrible happened. She fell and she never woke up." Mrs. Collins looked at me with a mix of pity and fear. "Some say her spirit never left. They hear her singing, just like you do." Chilled to the bone, I returned home, the weight of the old woman's words pressing heavily on my mind. That night, the singing resumed, more insistent and mournful than before. I could almost make out the words, the plea hidden within the melody. Desperation gnawed at me. I had to do something, but what? In a moment of impulsive courage, I decided to venture outside. Armed with a flashlight, I stepped into the cool night air, my breath visible in the pale moonlight. The garden seemed even more ominous under the cover of darkness. As I approached the swing, the singing grew louder, almost urgent. My heart raced as I reached out to touch the swing's frayed ropes, the air around me growing colder. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice trembling. "What do you want?" The swing stopped abruptly, and the singing ceased, replaced by a heavy silence. Suddenly, a child's laughter echoed through the yard, chilling me to the core. I turned, shining my flashlight into the shadows, but there was no one there. Just the empty garden and the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze. As I stood there, paralyzed by fear, a realization struck me. The swing wasn't just a relic of the past. It was a conduit, a gateway to something beyond my understanding. And whatever was on the other side was reaching out, desperate to be heard. Hey! Subscribe for more true scary stories. The following days were a blur of sleepless nights and frantic research. I scoured the local library, digging through old newspapers and town records, desperate to uncover any details about the tragedy Mrs. Collins had mentioned. The story of the little girl, Emily, was buried in the town's history, a forgotten footnote that few seemed willing to discuss. But the more I learned, the more the pieces began to fit together, revealing a tale of sorrow and lingering unrest. Emily Johnson had been just 7 years old when she died. The accident, as it was commonly referred to, occurred one autumn afternoon nearly 50 years ago. She had been playing on the swing, her favorite pastime, when the old rope snapped, sending her crashing to the ground. She succumbed to her injuries shortly after, and her grieving parents moved away, leaving the house to decay. Since then, the property had changed hands numerous times, each owner staying for only a brief period before abandoning it, claiming it was haunted. Determined to get to the bottom of this mystery, I sought out more information. I found an old photograph of Emily in the town archives, her innocent smile forever captured in black and white. There was something unsettling about her eyes, as if they were pleading for help. Armed with this new sense of purpose, I decided to hold a seance, hoping to make contact with her spirit and find out what she wanted. That evening, I gathered a few candles, a Ouija board, and some personal belongings I had found hidden in the attic, an old doll, a locket, and a faded diary. As the clock struck midnight, I lit the candles, creating a circle of flickering light around me. The air grew colder, and the familiar singing began, softer this time, almost inviting. "Emily," I called out, my voice steady despite the fear gnawing at my insides. "Are you here?" The planchette on the Ouija board moved slowly, spelling out, "YES." "Why are you still here?" I asked, my heart pounding. "What do you want?" The board responded, "FRIEND." I felt a chill run down my spine. "You're lonely," I whispered, understanding dawning on me. "You want someone to play with." The candles flickered, and the temperature dropped further. Suddenly, the room was filled with the scent of lavender, a fragrance that seemed out of place in the musty old house. The swing outside began to creak, and I heard the faint sound of a child's laughter, echoing eerily through the night. Just then, a gust of wind blew through the room, extinguishing the candles. In the darkness, I felt a presence, a cold, spectral touch on my shoulder. I turned quickly, but there was nothing there, only the shadows and the oppressive silence. I decided to reach out to Mrs. Collins again, hoping she might know more. When I told her about the seance, she looked at me with a mix of concern and disbelief. "You shouldn't meddle with things you don't understand," she warned. "Emily's spirit is restless for a reason. It's best to leave her be." "But she's just a child," I argued. "She needs help." Mrs. Collins sighed, her expression softening. "Sometimes the past is best left buried. But if you insist, there is one person who might be able to help, a medium named Madeline. She lives on the outskirts of town. People say she has a gift for communicating with the dead." That night, I made up my mind to visit Madeline. As I lay in bed, the singing resumed, but this time, it was accompanied by the sound of footsteps, light and rhythmic, moving through the house. I held my breath, straining to hear, my body frozen with fear. The footsteps stopped outside my door, and for a moment, all was silent. Then, the doorknob began to turn, slowly, methodically. I braced myself, ready to confront whatever was on the other side. But when the door creaked open, there was no one there, only the empty hallway and the haunting melody of a child's song. The next morning, I wasted no time in seeking out Madeline, the medium Mrs. Collins had mentioned. Her home was a small, unassuming cottage at the edge of a dense forest. The air around it felt thick with an ancient energy, as if the very ground held secrets of its own. I knocked on the weathered door, my heart pounding in my chest. Moments later, the door creaked open, revealing a woman in her 60s with piercing blue eyes that seemed to look straight into my soul. "You're here about Emily," she said, her voice calm and knowing. I nodded, feeling a mix of relief and apprehension. Madeline invited me inside, guiding me to a small sitting room filled with strange artifacts and the scent of burning sage. We sat across from each other, and she began to speak. "Emily's spirit is bound to that house because of the trauma she experienced. She's lost, unable to find peace. Can you help her?" I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. Madeline's eyes softened. "I can try. But you must understand, spirits like Emily's are often attached to something or someone. Finding the root cause of her unrest is the only way to free her." We spent the next hour discussing the details of Emily's life and death, her attachment to the swing, and the eerie occurrences I had experienced. Madeline listened intently, nodding occasionally. Finally, she stood up and walked over to a small wooden chest, pulling out a bundle of dried herbs and a silver pendant. "Tonight, we will attempt to communicate with Emily," she said. "But you must be prepared for whatever happens. Spirits can be unpredictable, especially those who have been restless for so long." That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Madeline and I returned to my house. The air was thick with anticipation and an otherworldly chill. We set up a circle of protection with the herbs and lit candles around the swing. Madeline held the pendant tightly, her eyes closed as she chanted softly. As midnight approached, the familiar singing began, but this time it was louder, more urgent. The swing moved violently, as if caught in a storm, despite the stillness of the night. Madeline's voice grew stronger, her chant filling the air with an ancient power. I felt a pressure building around us, the atmosphere growing heavy. "Emily, we are here to help you," Madeline called out. "Show yourself to us." The temperature plummeted, and a dense fog began to form around the swing. Within the mist, a small figure took shape, a little girl in a white dress, her face obscured by shadows. Emily's presence was palpable, her sadness and confusion almost tangible. "Why are you here, Emily?" Madeline asked gently. Emily's voice echoed through the mist, a haunting whisper. "I'm scared. I want to go home." "What's keeping you here?" Madeline pressed. The fog thickened, and Emily's figure flickered, her voice growing faint. "The man, he won't let me go." A cold dread washed over me. "What man?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Emily's form began to dissolve, her words echoing like a distant memory. "The man who watches from the shadows, he won't let me leave." Suddenly, a gust of wind extinguished the candles, plunging us into darkness. The swing stopped abruptly, and the mist vanished, taking Emily with it. Madeline and I were left standing in the cold night, the weight of Emily's words heavy upon us. Madeline turned to me, her expression grave. "There's more to this than we realized. Emily's spirit isn't just restless, she's being held captive by another entity. A dark presence that won't easily let her go." A shiver ran down my spine. "What do we do now?" "We need to confront this presence," Madeline replied. "But we must be careful. Whatever it is, it's powerful and dangerous." That night, as I lay in bed, the fear gnawing at me was different. It wasn't just about Emily anymore. It was about something darker, something that lurked in the shadows, watching and waiting. The next day, the weight of the revelation hung heavily over me. Madeline and I spent hours preparing for what lay ahead. She instructed me on protective rituals and gave me a small vial of holy water and a talisman for protection. As night approached, the sense of dread grew stronger, the air charged with an almost tangible energy. "Are you ready?" Madeline asked, her eyes serious and focused. I nodded, trying to suppress the fear gnawing at my insides. We returned to the garden, the swing eerily still in the moonlight. Madeline set up another circle of protection and lit candles around us. She began chanting softly, invoking the spirits for guidance and protection. The wind picked up, swirling around us, and the temperature dropped sharply. As the clock struck midnight, the familiar singing began, but this time it was accompanied by a low, menacing growl. The swing started to move violently, as if caught in an invisible storm. Shadows danced around us, and a feeling of intense malevolence filled the air. "Emily, we're here to help you," Madeline called out. "Show yourself." The fog returned, thicker this time, and within it, Emily's small figure appeared. She looked more frightened than ever, her eyes wide with terror. "He's coming," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He's angry." A dark figure emerged from the shadows, tall and menacing. It had no distinct features, just a void of darkness that seemed to absorb all light. The air around it crackled with a sinister energy. The entity moved towards us, its presence overwhelming. "Leave this place," Madeline commanded, her voice strong and unwavering. "You have no power here." The entity stopped, its form flickering as if struggling to maintain its shape. "She is mine," it hissed, its voice a guttural growl. "She will never leave." Madeline raised the vial of holy water and sprinkled it towards the entity, chanting louder. The entity recoiled, its form distorting. Emily's figure grew clearer, her eyes pleading. "Help me," she cried, her voice echoing through the night. Summoning all my courage, I stepped forward, holding the talisman tightly. "You can't have her," I shouted. "Emily deserves to be free." The entity roared, a sound that shook the very ground beneath us. It lunged towards me, but Madeline threw a handful of salt in its path, creating a barrier. The entity shrieked, its form dissolving into the air. Emily's figure wavered, her eyes filled with hope. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice fading as she began to disappear. "Go to the light, Emily," Madeline urged. "Find your peace." With one last, lingering glance, Emily's spirit vanished, the fog lifting and the air growing still. The oppressive feeling of malevolence faded, leaving behind a profound silence. Madeline and I stood there, exhausted but relieved. "It's over," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. As we gathered our things and headed back inside, I couldn't shake the feeling that something still lingered. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard a faint whisper, not a song, but a single word, filled with gratitude. "Thank you." But just as I began to drift off to sleep, a cold breeze swept through the room, and the sound of creaking wood reached my ears. The swing. I bolted upright, peering out the window. The swing was moving again, but this time, there was no singing, no laughter. Just the eerie sight of it swaying in the wind. A shadow moved behind it, tall and foreboding. My heart skipped a beat as the dark figure emerged from the shadows, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. The entity wasn't gone. It was never about Emily. It was about me. Hey. Subscribe for more true scary stories. Story 2. The door that wasn't there. From the moment I stepped into my new home, I knew something was off. The house, a dilapidated Victorian relic, had a charm that was hard to resist. High ceilings, ornate woodwork, and a staircase that creaked with every step. It was everything I had ever wanted in a house, a perfect place to start anew after my recent divorce. But the moment the front door closed behind me, a chill ran down my spine, as if the house itself had exhaled a cold breath. Unpacking took longer than expected, each box revealing remnants of a life I was trying to forget. As the sun set, casting long shadows through the stained glass windows, I decided to explore the basement. The landlord, Mr. Harris, had mentioned it was large and perfect for storage. Descending the narrow, wooden steps, I was hit by the musty smell of damp earth and old stone. The basement was vast, a labyrinth of brick and mortar. My flashlight flickered over the walls, revealing strange, faded markings. It was then that I saw it, a door, partially hidden behind a stack of old crates. It was an odd sight, a heavy wooden door with iron fittings, completely out of place in the otherwise unfinished basement. My curiosity piqued, I approached it and tried the handle. Locked. The next morning, over a cup of lukewarm coffee, I decided to call Mr. Harris. "There's a door in the basement," I told him, "it's locked. Do you have a key?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "A door?" he asked, his voice tinged with confusion. "There's no door in the basement, just a blank wall." "But I saw it," I insisted, "it's right behind a stack of crates." "You can't miss it." Mr. Harris was adamant. "I've owned that house for 20 years. Trust me, there's no door down there." "Maybe you're mistaken." Doubt gnawed at me, but I couldn't shake the memory of the door. That night, I dreamed of it, standing ominously in the dark, waiting for me. The next day, determined to prove I wasn't imagining things, I returned to the basement. The door was still there, just as solid and real as I remembered. I tried the handle again, but it wouldn't budge. I decided to take a different approach. Grabbing a crowbar from my toolbox, I wedged it into the gap between the door and the frame. Sweat beaded on my forehead as I strained against the resistance. Suddenly, there was a loud snap, and the door creaked open. A foul, damp smell wafted out, and my flashlight beam struggled to penetrate the darkness beyond. Peering inside, I could make out stone steps descending into the blackness. The air was cold, unnaturally so, and I hesitated. A sense of dread washed over me, but curiosity pushed me forward. Slowly, I began my descent, each step echoing ominously in the confined space. The further I went, the colder it became, and I could hear faint whispers, like the rustling of leaves in the wind. At the bottom of the stairs, the narrow corridor opened into a small chamber. The walls were lined with shelves filled with dusty jars and tattered books. In the center of the room was a large, stone altar, covered in strange symbols. As I stepped closer, the whispers grew louder, almost urgent. I reached out to touch one of the books when the door above slammed shut, plunging me into darkness. Panic surged through me as I fumbled for my flashlight. When I finally turned it on, the beam flickered weakly, illuminating the unsettling scene. My heart pounded in my chest, and I knew I had to get out. But as I turned to leave, I heard a voice, clear and cold, whispering my name from the shadows. "Hey, subscribe for more scary stories." My legs felt like lead as I stumbled up the stone steps, the voice from the shadows still echoing in my ears. When I reached the top, I threw my weight against the door, desperate to escape the oppressive darkness. It resisted for a moment before giving way, and I burst into the basement, gasping for air. I slammed the door shut behind me, leaning against it as I tried to steady my trembling hands. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the dark chamber, heard the whispers. By morning, my resolve was hardened. I needed answers. With determination, I drove to the local library, hoping to find some history on the house. The librarian, an elderly woman with kind eyes, was more than willing to help. "The old Victorian on Elm Street," she mused, flipping through a thick ledger. "Yes, I remember. It has quite a history. Built in the late 1800s by a wealthy industrialist, Jonathan Rookwood. Strange fellow, kept to himself mostly. There were rumors, of course. People said he was involved in dark rituals." My heart raced. "Dark rituals?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She nodded. "Yes, but nothing was ever proven. He disappeared without a trace one winter. The house was abandoned for years before it was sold. Back at the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The walls seemed to close in on me, and every creak and groan of the old structure set my nerves on edge. I knew I had to go back to the basement, despite the fear that gnawed at me. There were too many unanswered questions. Armed with a flashlight and a camera, I returned to the hidden chamber. The door creaked open, and I descended the stone steps once more. The air was as cold as ever, and the whispers started again, growing louder with each step. The chamber was just as I had left it, with the stone altar and shelves of dusty artifacts. I began taking pictures, hoping to capture some evidence of what I was experiencing. As I focused on the altar, I noticed something I had missed before, a small, leather-bound journal, half hidden under a pile of rags. I picked it up, brushing off the dust. The cover was embossed with a name, Jonathan Rookwood. Flipping through the brittle pages, I found entries detailing strange experiments and rituals. Rookwood had been obsessed with the idea of eternal life, believing he could cheat death through dark magic. His last entry was particularly chilling. "The ritual is almost complete. Tonight, I shall transcend this mortal coil." As I read, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. The air around me seemed to thrum with energy. Suddenly, the flashlight flickered and went out, plunging me into darkness. Panic surged through me, and I fumbled with the flashlight, trying to get it to work. When the beam finally flickered back to life, I saw them, shadowy figures standing around the altar, their eyes glowing in the dark. They spoke in unison, their voices a chilling whisper that echoed off the stone walls. "You should not have come here. This place is not for the living." Fear gripped me, but I couldn't move, couldn't tear my eyes away from the spectral forms. One of them stepped forward, and I recognized the face from old photographs, Jonathan Rookwood. His eyes bored into mine, and I felt a cold dread settle over me. "You have opened the door," he said, his voice a hiss. "Now you must face the consequences." The spectral figures closed in around me, their forms shifting and blending with the darkness. Jonathan Rookwood's hollow eyes seemed to pull me into an abyss. I struggled to break free from the paralysis of fear, my heart pounding so loudly I thought it might burst. I stumbled back, my foot catching on the edge of a step, and fell hard onto the cold stone floor. Rookwood's voice filled the chamber. "You have trespassed where the living do not belong. The ritual must be completed, and you shall be the vessel." Desperation fueled my movements as I scrambled to my feet. I clutched the journal tightly, hoping it might offer some clue, some way out of this nightmare. The whispers grew louder, swirling around me like a storm. I turned to the altar, its symbols glowing faintly, pulsing with an eerie light. I needed to understand what Rookwood had been trying to accomplish. Flipping through the journal, I found a page detailing the final ritual. The instructions were cryptic, filled with arcane symbols and phrases in a language I couldn't decipher. But one thing was clear: Rookwood had intended to bind his soul to the house, to achieve a twisted form of immortality. The air grew colder, and the spectral figures began to chant. Their voices melded into a single, droning note that resonated deep within my bones. I knew I had to act quickly. Rookwood had been obsessed with the idea of eternal life, but perhaps there was a way to break the ritual, to sever the connection between him and the house. With shaking hands, I rifled through the artifacts on the shelves, searching for something that might help. Among the dusty jars and ancient tomes, I found a small, ornate dagger. Its blade was inscribed with the same symbols that adorned the altar. Instinctively, I knew this was the key. The chanting grew louder, more frantic, as if the spirits sensed my intent. I approached the altar, the dagger heavy in my hand. Rookwood's voice echoed in my mind, a cacophony of anger and fear. "You cannot stop us. We are eternal." Ignoring the voice, I plunged the dagger into the center of the altar. The glow intensified, the symbols flaring brightly before fading into darkness. A deafening scream filled the chamber as the spectral figures writhed and twisted, their forms dissolving into mist. Suddenly, the whispers ceased. The oppressive cold lifted, and I was alone in the dark chamber. My flashlight flickered weakly, casting long shadows across the stone walls. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. The door at the top of the stairs was still ajar, a sliver of dim light piercing the darkness. As I made my way back up, I felt a strange sense of relief. The spirits were gone, their hold on the house broken. But as I reached the top step, a new sound stopped me in my tracks. It was faint, almost imperceptible, a heartbeat, slow and steady, coming from within the walls. Panic surged through me as I realized the truth. The ritual had not been broken, only altered. Rookwood's soul was still bound to the house, and now, it was connected to me as well. The house had become a living entity, its heart beating in time with mine. I fled the basement, slamming the door behind me. My mind raced as I tried to think of what to do next. Leaving the house wasn't an option. I was tied to it now, bound by the same dark magic that had ensnared Rookwood. I needed to find a way to sever the connection, to free myself from the grip of the supernatural. As I paced the dimly lit hallway, a plan began to form. There had to be a way to reverse the ritual, to banish Rookwood's spirit once and for all. The journal held the answers, I was sure of it. But time was running out, and the house seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, watching my every move. I knew I couldn't do this alone. I needed help, someone who understood the dark arts, someone who could guide me through the final steps. But as I reached for my phone to call Mr. Harris, the lights flickered, and a cold wind swept through the house. The front door creaked open, and a shadowy figure stood in the doorway. The shadowy figure stepped into the dim light of the hallway, revealing a gaunt, pale face beneath a wide-brimmed hat. He moved with a predatory grace, his eyes glinting with an unnatural light. My breath caught in my throat as I recognized him, Jonathan Rookwood, now fully manifest in the living world. "You cannot escape," he intoned, his voice a low growl. "We are bound, you and I. The house is alive, and so long as you remain within its walls, you shall never be free. Fear gripped me, but determination burned stronger. Clutching the journal, I stood my ground. I'll find a way to break the connection, I said, my voice trembling but resolute. I'll destroy you in this cursed house. Rookwood's lips curled into a sinister smile. You misunderstand, he whispered, stepping closer. The house is my body now, and you are its heart. Destroying it would mean destroying yourself. Desperation clawed at my thoughts, but I couldn't back down. I had to try, had to fight for my freedom. I flipped through the journal, searching for any hint, any clue that could help me. My fingers stopped on a page near the end, the ink faded but still legible. It described a counter-ritual, a way to sever the bond between spirit and structure. The ritual required two things, a sacrifice of blood and a symbol of life. Rookwood's presence grew oppressive, the air thickening with his malice. You cannot win, he hissed. The house will consume you. Ignoring his taunts, I ran to the kitchen, grabbing a knife. Blood and life. The words echoed in my mind as I sliced my palm, letting the blood drip onto the journal. The pages absorbed the crimson droplets, the symbols glowing faintly. My heart pounded with fear and hope. With the journal in one hand and the knife in the other, I returned to the basement door. The house seemed to resist my movements, the walls closing in, the floorboards creaking underfoot. The heartbeat grew louder, a drumbeat of doom. I descended the steps, Rookwood's ghostly form following, his eyes burning with hatred. In the chamber, I approached the altar once more. The symbols glowed brighter, responding to my blood. I placed my hand on the stone, feeling its cold surface pulse with a life of its own. This ends now, I whispered, lifting the knife. Rookwood's form shimmered, his voice rising in a furious wail. No! You will not defy me. Ignoring the spectral wails, I plunged the knife into the altar, the blade biting deep into the stone. The chamber trembled, the air crackling with energy. The symbols flared, burning with an intense light. I chanted the words from the journal, each syllable resonating with power. The house groaned, the walls shuddering as if in pain. Rookwood's form flickered, his screams echoing through the basement. The ground beneath me shook violently, and I feared the entire structure might collapse. But I continued, driven by a desperate need to be free. With a final, thunderous crack, the altar split in two. The symbols faded, the light dimming until only darkness remained. Rookwood's form dissolved, his screams fading into silence. The heartbeat stopped, and an eerie stillness settled over the chamber. Exhausted, I collapsed to the floor, the knife slipping from my grasp. I lay there for what felt like hours, my breath coming in ragged gasps. When I finally mustered the strength to stand, I climbed the stairs, each step feeling lighter than the last. The house, once oppressive and malevolent, seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. The front door was open, sunlight streaming in. I stepped outside, the warmth of the sun on my skin a stark contrast to the cold darkness of the basement. I knew I couldn't stay. The house, though no longer haunted, held too many dark memories. I had to leave, to start anew. As I walked away, I glanced back one last time. The house stood silent, its windows reflecting the morning light. The door to the basement was closed, locked forever. The nightmare was over. Or so I hoped. Yet, as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that some part of Rookwood still lingered, waiting for another soul to discover the door that wasn't there. Hey! Subscribe for more true scary stories. Story 3. Enigma of the Carved Symbol. I woke up to the sound of soft whispers, like a distant conversation just out of earshot. Disoriented, I blinked against the darkness, my eyes gradually adjusting to the faint glow emanating from the floor. There, in the center of my bedroom, was a strange symbol carved into the wood, surrounded by a circle of flickering candles that hadn't been there when I went to bed. My heart raced as I threw off the covers and sat up, my breath visible in the unnaturally cold air. The symbol was intricate, with interlocking lines and strange, almost runic characters. It looked ancient, like something out of an old grimoire. I shivered, not just from the cold, but from a growing sense of dread. How had this gotten here? Who had done this while I slept? I reached for my phone, only to find it dead despite being on the charger all night. The digital clock on my bedside table was also off. It was as if the room itself had been drained of power. I took a deep breath and tried to steady my nerves. This is just a prank, I whispered to myself, but the words felt hollow. I slid out of bed and approached the symbol, the air growing colder with each step. The candles flickered more violently, casting eerie shadows that danced across the walls. I crouched down and ran my fingers over the carvings. They were deep and precise, too perfect to have been made in haste. As I traced the lines, a sudden gust of wind blew through the room, extinguishing the candles and plunging me into darkness. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, and I could swear they were calling my name. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice trembling. There was no response, only the relentless whispering that seemed to seep into my very bones. Panicking, I groped for the flashlight I kept in the nightstand. Its beam sliced through the darkness, revealing that the symbol was now glowing faintly, emitting a sickly green light. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the rug. This was no ordinary prank. Something malevolent was at play here, something far beyond my understanding. Determined to find out more, I grabbed an old journal from my bookshelf, one I had inherited from my grandfather. He had been an occult enthusiast, always scribbling down notes on various supernatural phenomena. Flipping through the pages, I searched for any mention of the symbol now etched into my floor. As I turned the pages, the whispers intensified, as if they were reacting to my actions. There, on a dog-eared page, was a sketch of the very same symbol. My grandfather had labeled it the Mark of the Watchers. According to his notes, it was a sign used by ancient cults to summon and communicate with otherworldly entities. The implications were chilling. Had someone or something been trying to reach out to me? And if so, why? I had to get out of there. The air was growing unbearably cold, and the sense of an unseen presence pressing down on me was overwhelming. I stuffed the journal into my backpack and rushed for the door, only to find it locked from the outside. My heart pounded in my chest as I yanked on the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers grew louder still, converging into a cacophony of voices that drowned out my thoughts. "Let me out!" I screamed, pounding on the door. The room seemed to close in around me, the walls vibrating with an unseen force. Just as I thought I would lose my mind, the door flew open with a deafening crash. I stumbled into the hallway, gasping for breath. As I turned back to look at my room, the symbol's glow faded, and the whispers ceased, leaving an eerie silence in their wake. But the chill remained, a lingering reminder that whatever had entered my room was far from gone. I knew then that this was just the beginning, that the symbol was a gateway to something far more sinister. And as I stood there, trembling in the darkened hallway, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The house seemed different, shadows lurking in every corner, and the faintest of noises making me jump. At dawn, I called my best friend, Sarah. She had always been the rational one, the skeptic who didn't believe in anything she couldn't see or touch. I needed her pragmatism now more than ever. Sarah arrived within the hour, her expression a mix of concern and curiosity. I led her to my room, showing her the carved symbol and the melted candles. "This isn't a joke, Sarah. I woke up to find this in my room." And the whispers, they were real. She examined the symbol, her brow furrowed. "This is intense," she admitted. "Have you called the police?" I shook my head. "And tell them what? That a ghost carved a symbol into my floor? They'd think I'm crazy." Sarah nodded, conceding the point. "Okay, let's think this through. You said your grandfather had something similar in his journal?" I retrieved the journal and showed her the page. She read it silently, her face growing paler with each line. "The Mark of the Watchers," she whispered. "This is heavy stuff, Nick. If your grandfather believed in this, maybe there's something to it." We spent the day researching. Every website and book we could find on the symbol and ancient cults offered more questions than answers. The mark of the Watchers seemed to be associated with summoning rituals, but the specifics were elusive, shrouded in mystery and half-truths. It was almost as if the information was intentionally obscured. By evening, frustration was setting in. "We need help," Sarah said. "Someone who knows about this kind of thing. Do you know any of your grandfather's old friends? Maybe someone from his occult circles?" I thought about it. My grandfather had been reclusive in his later years, but I remembered a name. Professor Elias Gray, an old colleague who still taught at the local university. I managed to find his number and gave him a call. When I explained the situation, he agreed to meet us at his office. Professor Gray was an imposing figure with a stern expression softened only by his genuine curiosity. "I've known your grandfather for many years," he said, after we had shown him the journal. He was a brilliant man, deeply immersed in the study of the supernatural. We described the symbol and the events of the previous night. Gray's eyes widened slightly, but he remained composed. "The mark of the Watchers," he said thoughtfully. "It is indeed a powerful symbol, believed to be a conduit to another realm. Those who use it often seek to communicate with entities from beyond our world. Why would someone carve it in my room?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Gray hesitated. "It's possible they were trying to establish a connection. The fact that you experienced whispers suggests an attempt at communication, albeit a crude one. But this isn't something to be taken lightly. The forces at play here can be dangerous." His words sent a chill down my spine. "What do we do?" "You need to break the connection," Gray said firmly. "Destroy the symbol, cleanse the room. It's not a guaranteed solution, but it's a start. And you must be careful. If this is the work of someone deliberately summoning these entities, they won't stop easily." Back home, Sarah and I prepared to follow Gray's advice. Armed with salt, sage, and a hammer, we approached the symbol with trepidation. I hesitated, but Sarah's presence gave me the courage to proceed. I scattered salt around the room, then lit the sage, waving it over the symbol as Gray had instructed. The air seemed to crackle with tension. Finally, I took the hammer and struck the center of the carving. The floor splintered, the symbol disrupted. For a moment, it felt like the room exhaled, a pressure lifting. But then, the temperature plummeted, and a low, guttural growl filled the air. The whispers returned, louder and more frantic than before. "Nick, we need to go!" Sarah shouted, grabbing my arm. We ran from the room, the growl following us down the hallway. As we slammed the front door behind us, I knew we had only just begun to understand the true nature of the forces we were dealing with. The entity was angered, and it was coming for us. Sarah and I didn't go back to my house that night. Instead, we checked into a motel, hoping to find some semblance of safety. The whispers, the growl, it all felt too real, too immediate. As we sat in the dimly lit room, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I kept glancing at the door, half expecting it to burst open. "We need a plan," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "We can't keep running. We need to find out who did this and why." I nodded, clutching my grandfather's journal. Gray said it was an attempt at communication. But why me? What did they want? Sarah tapped her chin thoughtfully. "Maybe it's not just about you. Maybe it's something your grandfather was involved in. Did he have any enemies? Anyone who might want revenge or power?" I shrugged, feeling helpless. "I don't know. He was secretive about his work. There could be 100 reasons." The next morning, we returned to the university to speak with Professor Gray again. He greeted us with a somber expression, sensing the urgency of our visit. "I did some digging of my own," he said. "And I found something that might explain why this is happening now." He led us to his office, where an old book lay open on his desk. The pages were yellowed with age, filled with archaic symbols and handwritten notes. "This is a grimoire," he explained. "A book of spells and rituals. Your grandfather and I studied it extensively. One entry stands out, a summoning ritual that matches the mark of the Watchers. Gray pointed to a passage. It mentions a powerful entity, one that grants knowledge and power to those who summon it. But the price is steep. It requires a blood sacrifice, and the connection, once established, is nearly impossible to sever. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. So, someone is trying to gain power by summoning this entity? And they're using me as a conduit? Gray nodded. It's possible. The timing of your grandfather's death and the appearance of the symbol can't be a coincidence. They might be using his connection to you to strengthen their hold. We need to find out who, Sarah said, her jaw set. And we need to stop them. Gray handed me a small vial of liquid. This is holy water, blessed by a priest. Use it to cleanse the symbol completely. It might help weaken the connection. But be warned, whoever is behind this won't give up easily. Armed with the holy water and a renewed sense of purpose, we headed back to my house. The place felt different, more oppressive. As if it resented our intrusion. I steeled myself and entered my room, where the remnants of the symbol still marred the floor. With Sarah by my side, I poured the holy water over the carvings, reciting a cleansing prayer Gray had given us. The room seemed to resist, the air growing colder, the whispers returning with a vengeance. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. Suddenly, the floorboards began to creak and shift. The symbol glowed one last time before fading completely. The room went silent, the oppressive weight lifting slightly. I exhaled, realizing I'd been holding my breath. We did it, Sarah said, relief in her voice. For now, at least. But as we turned to leave, a figure appeared in the doorway. A man, tall and gaunt, with a sinister smile that sent chills down my spine. You meddled where you shouldn't have, he hissed. The entity demands its due. Before we could react, the man lunged at us, his eyes glowing with an unnatural light. Sarah screamed, and I fought to keep him at bay, the vial of holy water our only weapon. In the struggle, I smashed the vial against his face. He recoiled, screaming in agony as his skin sizzled and burned. Go! I shouted at Sarah, pushing her towards the door. We ran down the hallway, the man's screams echoing behind us. But as we reached the front door, it slammed shut, trapping us inside. The whispers returned, louder than ever, and the temperature plummeted. I knew then that we were trapped, and the entity would stop at nothing to claim us. The true horror had just begun, and there was no escape from the haunted grip of the unknown force that pursued us. Sarah and I were trapped in my house, the air thick with the malevolent presence that had been awakened. The man who had attacked us lay motionless in the hallway, his face still smoldering from the holy water. But I knew it wasn't over. The entity, whatever it was, wanted us, and it wouldn't stop until it had us. We need to find another way out, Sarah said, her voice trembling but determined. There has to be a way. We moved cautiously through the house, every creak of the floorboards making my heart race. The shadows seemed to shift and move on their own, and the whispers followed us, relentless and insistent. It felt like the house itself was alive, a living entity bent on our destruction. In the kitchen, we found a large window that overlooked the backyard. It was our best chance. I grabbed a chair and smashed the glass, the sound echoing through the house like a gunshot. We scrambled through the broken window, cutting our hands on the shards, but we didn't care. We were outside, away from the suffocating darkness of the house. But as we stood in the backyard, catching our breath, a cold wind swept through the air, and the whispers followed us, growing louder. The entity wasn't confined to the house, it was everywhere. Sarah grabbed my arm, her eyes wide with terror. We need to end this, Nick. We need to find out who summoned this thing and stop them. I nodded, feeling a surge of determination. Let's go back to Gray. He might know what to do. We ran to the car and sped towards the university, the oppressive presence lingering at the edges of our perception. When we arrived, Professor Gray was waiting for us, his face grim. I feared this might happen, he said. The entity has been awakened and it will not rest until it has what it wants. How do we stop it? I demanded. Gray sighed. The ritual must be completed, but on our terms. We need to summon the entity fully and then banish it. It will be dangerous, but it's the only way. He led us to a basement beneath the university, a place lined with old books and arcane symbols. It felt ancient and powerful, a place where the veil between worlds was thin. Gray set up the ritual, placing candles and drawing symbols on the floor. We will need a conduit, he said. Someone to channel the entity so we can banish it. I'll do it, I said without hesitation. This started with me. I'll end it. Gray nodded, respecting my decision. He handed me a small, ornate dagger. You must cut your palm and let the blood drip onto the symbol. It will call the entity. Be strong, Nick. This will be difficult. I took a deep breath and did as he instructed, wincing as the blade sliced into my skin. Blood dripped onto the symbol, and the candles flickered violently. The air grew colder, and the whispers became a deafening roar. The entity was coming. Suddenly, a vortex of darkness formed in the center of the room, and a figure began to emerge, its form shifting and flickering like a nightmare. It was the entity, and it was more terrifying than I could have imagined. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and its presence filled the room with an overwhelming sense of dread. Gray began to chant, his voice steady and strong. Sarah joined in, her voice adding to the power of the ritual. I stood in the center, feeling the entity's gaze upon me, its whispers filling my mind with promises of power and terror. I fought to keep my focus, knowing that any lapse would doom us all. The entity reached out, its tendrils of darkness wrapping around me. I screamed, feeling my very soul being pulled towards it. But Gray's chant grew louder, more insistent, and I felt a surge of power flow through me. I gripped the dagger tightly and plunged it into the heart of the symbol. The entity let out a deafening scream, and the vortex of darkness began to collapse in on itself. The tendrils loosened, and the whispers faded. The room shook violently, and then, with a final burst of light, the entity was gone. I collapsed to the floor, exhausted but alive. Sarah and Gray rushed to my side, their faces filled with relief. We did it, Gray said, helping me to my feet. The entity is banished. It cannot harm you anymore. But as we left the basement, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The air felt different, lighter, but there was a lingering sense of unease. I looked at Sarah and saw the same doubt in her eyes. The entity was gone, but the symbol on my floor had opened a door to something far greater. And I knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning of our battle against the unknown. Story 4. The Witching Hour. I've always been a night owl, but lately, something strange has been happening. It started about a month ago, when I first noticed the pattern. Every time I glanced at the clock, it was 3:33 a.m. At first, I chalked it up to coincidence, a quirk of my sleep cycle. But as the nights went on, the eerie consistency began to unsettle me. It was a Tuesday when I first became truly alarmed. I had been tossing and turning in bed, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. When I finally gave in to my insomnia and checked the time, it was 3:33 a.m. My heart raced, a cold sweat breaking out on my forehead. There was no logical explanation for why this time kept appearing, but the fear it instilled in me was undeniable. That night, I woke with a start. My room was shrouded in darkness, save for the faint glow of the moonlight seeping through the curtains. The air was thick and oppressive, making it hard to breathe. I reached for my phone to check the time, and once again, it was 3:33 a.m. A chill ran down my spine as I noticed something else. The digital clock on my nightstand was also frozen at 3:33. I tried to shake off the unease and drifted back to sleep, but the next morning, a sense of dread lingered. I went through my day in a daze, unable to focus on work or conversations. That night, the same thing happened. Waking at 3:33 a.m., the clock's all frozen, a creeping sense of fear gnawing at my sanity. Determined to understand what was happening, I began researching supernatural phenomena related to specific times. my search led me to the concept of the witching hour, traditionally believed to be a time when the veil between the living and the dead is thinnest. It was a chilling thought, but I wasn't one to believe in such things. At least, not until now. Desperate for answers, I visited an antique shop in town known for its collection of esoteric books. The shopkeeper, a wizened old man with a knowing glint in his eye, seemed to sense my distress. Without a word, he handed me a dusty tome titled The Witching Hour and Beyond. I devoured the book, finding tales of spirits trapped in time, entities that could manipulate clocks to convey messages from the beyond. One story, in particular, caught my attention. It spoke of a spirit bound to 3:33 a.m., seeking to communicate with the living. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Was I being haunted? That night, I went to bed with a sense of trepidation. My eyes darted to the clock every few minutes, anxiety mounting as the hours ticked by. When I finally drifted off, I dreamed of a shadowy figure standing at the foot of my bed. Its eyes glowed with a malevolent light, and when I woke, gasping for breath, the clock read 3:33 a.m. Hey, subscribe for more scary stories. The dream haunted me long after I woke. The image of that shadowy figure burned into my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The clocks, the dreams, the oppressive feeling in my home, it all pointed to one thing. I was being haunted, and whatever it was, it wanted something from me. Determined to uncover the truth, I decided to visit the shopkeeper again. His knowing glance the first time I visited suggested he might have more information. When I walked into the shop, the air was thick with the scent of old books and incense. The shopkeeper looked up from his counter, his eyes narrowing as he saw me. "I knew you'd be back," he said, his voice a raspy whisper. "You're dealing with something powerful. Something ancient." I explained what had been happening, the clocks, the dreams, and the oppressive feeling. He listened intently, nodding occasionally. When I finished, he sighed deeply. "You're dealing with a time-bound spirit," he said. "These spirits are connected to a specific moment in time, often the moment of their death. They're trapped, unable to move on, and they latch onto the living, hoping to find a way to free themselves." The shopkeeper handed me a small, ornate box. "Inside this box is an amulet," he said. "It's meant to protect you from the spirit's influence. But be warned, using it could anger the spirit." I took the box, feeling its weight in my hand. I had no choice. I had to try something, anything, to stop this haunting. That night, I placed the amulet under my pillow and went to bed. As I drifted off, I hoped the amulet would keep the spirit at bay. I woke with a start, my heart pounding. The room was cold, the air thick with a sense of malevolence. I glanced at the clock. It was 3:33 a.m., but this time, the clock wasn't frozen. The seconds ticked by, a small comfort in the midst of my fear. Suddenly, a cold breeze swept through the room. I turned, and there it was, the shadowy figure from my dream. It stood at the foot of my bed, its eyes glowing with an eerie light. It pointed a bony finger at me, its mouth moving soundlessly. My blood ran cold as I realized it was trying to communicate. Gathering my courage, I reached for the amulet. As soon as I touched it, the figure recoiled, its form flickering. It let out a silent scream, the force of its anger shaking the room. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished, leaving me gasping for breath. The next day, I knew I needed to learn more about the spirit. I returned to the shopkeeper, who suggested I visit the local library. There, I found records of a woman who had died under mysterious circumstances in my house, precisely at 3:33 a.m. Her name was Eliza, and she had been accused of witchcraft in the late 1800s. Eliza's story was tragic. Falsely accused and executed, her spirit had become trapped, reliving the moment of her death every night. I felt a pang of sympathy for her, but I also knew I had to find a way to free her spirit if I ever wanted peace. That night, I prepared for what I hoped would be my final encounter with Eliza. Armed with the amulet and the knowledge I had gained, I waited for the witching hour, determined to confront the spirit and end the haunting once and for all. As the minutes ticked by, I could feel my anxiety mounting. I clutched the amulet tightly, hoping it would protect me as it had before. The house was eerily silent, the only sound the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. My eyes were glued to the clock on my nightstand, watching as the numbers changed, each second bringing me closer to 3:33 a.m. When the clock finally struck 3:33, a chill swept through the room. The air grew thick, almost suffocating, and I knew Eliza was there. The shadowy figure materialized at the foot of my bed, just as she had in my dreams. This time, however, I was ready. "Eliza," I said, my voice trembling. "I know what happened to you. I know you were falsely accused and executed. I'm here to help you find peace." The figure flickered, her eyes glowing with a mix of anger and sorrow. She moved closer, her mouth forming words I couldn't hear. I reached for the book the shopkeeper had given me, flipping to the section on time-bound spirits. According to the text, I needed to perform a ritual to help Eliza's spirit move on. With shaking hands, I began to recite the incantation. The words felt foreign on my tongue, but I forced myself to continue, my voice growing stronger with each syllable. Eliza's form wavered, her eyes wide with surprise. As I spoke, I could feel a shift in the air, as if the very fabric of time was being altered. Suddenly, Eliza let out a piercing scream, her figure dissolving into a whirlwind of shadows. The room shook, objects flying off the shelves as the spirit's anger and pain were unleashed. I clung to the amulet, focusing on the incantation, praying it would be enough to free her. Just as I thought I couldn't take any more, the room fell silent. The shadows dissipated, and the oppressive feeling lifted. I opened my eyes to find the clock ticking normally, the numbers changing as the seconds passed. Eliza was gone. Exhausted, I collapsed onto the bed, the adrenaline slowly leaving my system. I had done it. I had freed her spirit. But as I lay there, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. The house was quiet, too quiet, and a nagging doubt crept into my mind. The next day, I decided to investigate further. I returned to the library, poring over records and old newspapers. I discovered that Eliza had a daughter, Emily, who had mysteriously disappeared around the same time. It seemed the tragedy of Eliza's death extended beyond her own fate. I knew I had to find out what happened to Emily. If her spirit was also trapped, the haunting might not be over. I returned home, determined to uncover the truth. That night, I set up a camera in my bedroom, hoping to capture any supernatural activity. I wanted evidence, something concrete to prove I wasn't losing my mind. At 3:33 a.m., I woke to find the room filled with a strange light. The camera was recording, and I could see a faint figure in the corner of the room. It was smaller than Eliza, almost childlike. My heart raced as I realized I might be looking at Emily. I reached for the amulet, holding it out towards the figure. "Emily," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "If you're here, show me a sign." The figure moved closer, and I felt a gentle breeze brush my face. The clock on my nightstand ticked normally, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. I knew then that my journey was far from over. Emily's spirit was still here, and I had to help her find peace, just as I had with her mother. The revelation that Emily's spirit lingered filled me with a mix of dread and determination. I couldn't abandon her, not after learning what she and her mother had endured. The next day, I returned to the shopkeeper, hoping he could offer more guidance. The old man listened quietly as I recounted the previous night's events, his eyes narrowing in thought. "It seems Emily is bound to this house, just like her mother," he said finally. "Their spirits are linked by the tragedy they suffered. To free Emily, you'll need to delve deeper into the history of your home and uncover the truth about her disappearance." I spent the next few days researching tirelessly. I combed through old records, spoke with local historians, and even visited the site where Eliza had been executed. Slowly, the pieces began to fall into place. Emily had been hidden away by a neighbor after her mother's death, but she had died of illness shortly after. Her spirit, confused and lost, had returned to the only place she knew as home. Armed with this knowledge, I prepared for what I hoped would be my final encounter with Emily. I set up the camera again, placed the amulet under my pillow, and recited the incantation I had used to free Eliza. This time, I included Emily's name, hoping to reach her spirit. As the clock neared 3:33 a.m., the familiar chill crept into the room. I sat up, heart pounding, and waited. The faint figure of Emily appeared in the corner, her small form shrouded in a soft, ethereal light. She looked at me with wide, sorrowful eyes, and I felt an overwhelming urge to help her. "Emily," I said softly, "I know what happened to you. I know you were scared and alone. But you don't have to be anymore. I'm here to help you find peace." Her figure wavered, and I could feel the temperature drop even further. I reached for the amulet, holding it out towards her. "Your mother is waiting for you, Emily. It's time for you to go to her." A gust of wind swept through the room, and Emily's form began to dissolve into the air. She let out a soft, heartbreaking cry, and I felt tears well up in my eyes. The clock struck 3:33 a.m., and as the seconds ticked by, Emily's spirit faded away, leaving the room silent and still. I checked the camera, watching the footage in awe. I had captured everything: the ethereal light, the figure of Emily, and her final, heartbreaking departure. I had proof of what I had experienced, but more importantly, I had freed both Eliza and Emily from their torment. The next few days passed in a blur. I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in weeks. The clocks in my house returned to normal, and the oppressive feeling lifted. I knew the spirits were finally at rest, and my home was once again just a home. One evening, as I sat on the porch, I reflected on everything that had happened. The fear, the sleepless nights, the research, it had all been worth it to give Eliza and Emily the peace they deserved. I felt a sense of closure, knowing I had done the right thing. But as the sun set and the shadows grew long, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me. The unease crept back, and I glanced at my watch. It was 3:33 p.m. My heart skipped a beat. The time had followed me into the day. A cold breeze brushed past me, and I turned, expecting to see nothing. But there, standing at the edge of the porch, was a figure I didn't recognize. Taller than Eliza, older than Emily, its eyes glowed with an unsettling intensity. It seemed I had only scratched the surface of the haunting. The figure moved closer, and I felt the cold grip of fear tighten around my heart. This was far from over. The witching hour was just the beginning. Story 5. The Sonai's Doll. It was a damp, overcast afternoon when the package arrived. The air felt thick with an almost suffocating stillness, as if the world had paused to watch what was about to unfold. I found the plain brown box on my doorstep, unmarked except for my name scrawled in jagged letters across the top. There was no return address. A shiver ran down my spine as I picked it up, the weight oddly disproportionate to its size. Inside, nestled within crumpled newspaper, was a doll. It looked exactly like me, right down to the mole on my left cheek. But the eyes were sewn shut with thick, black thread. The sight of it made my heart race and my hands tremble. I could feel an unsettling energy emanating from it, a silent scream trapped within its stitched eyes. I tried to laugh it off, telling myself it was some sort of elaborate prank. But the unease clung to me, refusing to let go. I placed the doll on my kitchen table and sat down, staring at it as if it might suddenly spring to life. The longer I looked, the more I felt those stitched eyes watching me, judging me, despite their blindness. That night, sleep was elusive. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind outside my window seemed amplified, echoing the dread that had settled in my chest. I kept the bedroom door open, unable to shake the feeling that I needed to keep an eye on the doll. I felt silly, but the fear was real, tangible. In the early hours of the morning, I woke with a start. My heart pounded in my chest, the remnants of a nightmare fading like shadows at dawn. I reached for my phone, its glow illuminating the dark room, and checked the time. It was 3:15 a.m. I rolled over, trying to find the comfort of sleep again, but the sense of being watched gnawed at me. The next day, I decided to investigate. I called my closest friends, asking if any of them had sent the doll as a joke. Their confusion and genuine concern only heightened my anxiety. I even took to social media, posting a picture of the doll with a caption asking for any information. The responses were swift but unhelpful, a mixture of jokes, sympathy, and wild theories. As days turned into a week, the doll became an unwelcome fixture in my life. Its presence was a constant reminder of the unknown threat lurking just out of sight. I moved it from room to room, trying to find a place where it didn't feel like it was invading my personal space. But no matter where I put it, those sullen eyes seemed to follow me, haunting my every move. It was on the 7th night that things took a turn for the worse. I woke again at 3:15 a.m., the air in my bedroom icy and still. I glanced at the doll, now sitting on my dresser, and felt a surge of terror. The threads on its eyes were coming loose, one stitch at a time. I watched in horrified fascination as the final thread snapped and the doll's eyes opened. They were my eyes. I scrambled out of bed, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The doll sat there, its eyes, my eyes, staring back at me with a cold, unblinking intensity. My skin crawled with a sense of foreboding. I tried to convince myself it was a trick of the light, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion. But deep down, I knew better. The next morning, I couldn't shake the memory of those eyes. I had to get rid of the doll. Wrapping it in an old towel, I drove to the nearest dumpster and tossed it in, relieved to be rid of the unsettling presence. But as I drove away, I couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see it following me. That night, I slept a little easier, telling myself the ordeal was over. But when I woke at 3:15 a.m. again, my blood ran cold. The doll was back, sitting on my dresser, its eyes now wide open and lifeless. Panic surged through me. How had it returned? Was someone playing a cruel joke, or was something more sinister at work? I decided to confide in my friend, Lisa, who was into the supernatural. She listened intently as I recounted the events, her expression growing more serious by the minute. "You need to find out where it came from," she said. "There might be something attached to it, a spirit or a curse." We spent the next few days researching, poring over old books and obscure websites. The more we learned, the more ominous the situation seemed. Dolls had long been used in rituals, vessels for spirits seeking to connect with the living. The eyes, it seemed, were a gateway, a way for whatever was attached to the doll to see into my world. Determined to break the connection, Lisa suggested a cleansing ritual. We gathered sage, salt, and candles, setting up a makeshift altar in my living room. As we chanted and waved the burning sage around the doll, I felt a strange mix of fear and hope. Maybe this would finally put an end to the nightmare. But as the ritual progressed, the atmosphere in the room shifted. The temperature dropped, and a palpable tension filled the air. The doll's eyes seemed to glow with an inner light, and I felt a pressure building in my chest, as if something were trying to force its way out. The candles flickered wildly, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Just as we finished the ritual, a loud crash echoed through the house. We ran to the source of the noise and found the doll on the floor, its face twisted into a grotesque grin. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized the ritual hadn't worked. If anything, it seemed to have made things worse. Lisa looked at me, her face pale. "I think we need professional help," she said, her voice trembling. "There's something very wrong here." Reluctantly, I agreed. We reached out to a local paranormal investigator, a man named Marcus who had a reputation for dealing with cases like mine. He agreed to come over the next day. As night fell, I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of dread. Whatever was happening, it was far from over. I tried to sleep, but every sound made me jump, every shadow seemed to move. When I woke again at 3:15 a.m., I found the doll sitting at the foot of my bed, its eyes gleaming in the darkness. It opened its mouth, and in a voice that chilled me to the bone, it whispered, "I see you." Marcus arrived the next morning, a tall, stern man with a no-nonsense demeanor. He listened carefully as Lisa and I recounted the events of the past week, taking notes and occasionally nodding. When we finished, he looked at the doll with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "This is more than a simple haunting," he said. There's a malevolent spirit attached to this doll. We need to find out why. Marcus began by setting up various pieces of equipment around my house: cameras, motion detectors, and EVP recorders. He explained that we needed to document any activity to better understand the entity we were dealing with. As night fell, the three of us settled into the living room, the doll placed on a table in the center, its eyes still and lifeless. The hours ticked by in tense silence, each of us watching the doll, waiting for something to happen. Just as the clock struck midnight, a sudden chill swept through the room. The lights flickered, and a low, whispering sound filled the air. Marcus leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he strained to hear. "Do you hear that?" he asked. We nodded, the whispers growing louder, more distinct. It was a voice, soft and eerie, speaking in a language I couldn't understand. The doll's eyes seemed to follow the sound, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. Marcus picked up an EVP recorder, holding it towards the doll. "Who are you?" he asked. The whispering stopped abruptly, and for a moment, the room was deathly silent. Then, in a voice that sent chills through my entire body, the doll replied, "I am the one who sees." The lights flickered again, and a cold wind blew through the room, extinguishing the candles we had lit. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, my heart pounding in my chest. Marcus sprang into action, drawing a circle of salt around the doll and chanting in a language I didn't recognize. The air seemed to crackle with energy, the room growing colder by the second. The doll's eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. I felt a pressure building in my head, a sense of impending doom. Just as I thought I couldn't take it any longer, the whispers stopped, and the room fell silent once more. Marcus looked up, sweat dripping from his brow. "It's strong," he said, his voice shaky. "But I think we've weakened it for now. We need to find out more about where this doll came from. There has to be a reason it's targeting you." We spent the next few hours combing through the internet, searching for any clue that might explain the doll's origins. It was Lisa who finally found something, an old news article about a woman who had been found dead in her home, clutching a doll with sewn eyes. The article mentioned strange occurrences leading up to her death, unexplained noises, cold spots, and the feeling of being watched. My blood ran cold as I read the article. The woman's name was Margaret Johnson, and she had lived in a town not far from here. Her death had been ruled a heart attack, but the details were eerily similar to what I had been experiencing. "We need to go to her house," Marcus said. "There might be something there that can help us understand what's going on." As dawn broke, we gathered our things and prepared to leave. I felt a mix of fear and determination, knowing that whatever lay ahead, we had to face it. The doll remained on the table, its eyes closed once more, but I could still feel its presence, a dark shadow looming over us. We drove in silence, the weight of the past week's events hanging heavy in the air. When we arrived at Margaret Johnson's house, it was a dilapidated old building, its windows boarded up and the yard overgrown with weeds. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what was to come. Stepping inside, the air felt thick and oppressive, the shadows whispering secrets from the past. As we made our way through the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that the doll's eyes were still on me, even from miles away. The inside of Margaret Johnson's house was like stepping into another world. Dust coated every surface, and the air was thick with the scent of decay. Each creak of the floorboards underfoot seemed to echo through the empty rooms, a ghostly reminder of the life that had once filled this space. Marcus led the way, his flashlight casting long shadows that danced on the walls. We found Margaret's bedroom at the end of a long hallway. The bed was unmade, clothes were scattered on the floor, and the wallpaper was peeling away. On the nightstand was a photo of Margaret, smiling with a doll clutched in her arms, the same doll that now haunted me. Seeing the photo sent a chill down my spine. Marcus set up his equipment, placing a few candles around the room and sprinkling salt in a protective circle. Lisa and I stood back, watching as he began another ritual, chanting softly. The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to gather, pressing in around us. I could feel a presence, something dark and malevolent, lurking just out of sight. As Marcus chanted, the whispers began again, louder this time, more insistent. The candles flickered, and a cold wind swirled through the room, lifting the pages of an old diary that lay on the nightstand. Lisa grabbed the diary, flipping through the pages frantically. "Look at this," she said, her voice trembling. "Margaret wrote about the doll. She said it was given to her by a stranger, that it watched her, that it wanted something from her." My heart pounded as Lisa read aloud. Margaret had tried to get rid of the doll, just as I had, but it always came back. She wrote about the eyes, how they seemed to see into her soul, how the doll spoke to her in her dreams, whispering dark secrets and terrifying visions. It had driven her to the brink of madness, and in her final entry, she wrote that she could feel it taking over, that she was losing herself to its power. The room grew colder still, and the whispers turned into a roar. The candles went out, plunging us into darkness. I could feel the presence, pressing down on us, suffocating. Marcus shouted, his voice barely audible over the noise, "We need to break the connection. There has to be something here, something that ties the doll to this place." In the chaos, I noticed a small, locked box under the bed. I grabbed it and forced it open, revealing a collection of old letters and a locket. The letters were from a man named Henry, professing his undying love for Margaret. The locket contained a picture of the two of them together, smiling, happy. But as I held it, I felt a jolt of recognition. The man in the photo looked just like me. A cold realization washed over me. The doll wasn't just a random curse, it was connected to me through Margaret and Henry. The spirit that haunted the doll had latched onto me because of my resemblance to Henry, a love that had been twisted into something dark and vengeful over the years. The eyes were its way of seeing me, of finding Henry once more. Marcus took the locket and placed it in the center of the salt circle, pouring more salt over it and chanting louder. The room seemed to vibrate with energy, the whispers rising to a deafening pitch. I felt a pressure in my chest, as if something were trying to rip its way out. But then, with a final, desperate cry, the noise stopped. The room fell silent. The candles flickered back to life, and the oppressive weight lifted. I could feel the presence receding, the doll's power broken. Marcus looked exhausted but relieved. "It's over," he said. "The spirit has moved on." It was the locket, the connection to its past, that kept it anchored here. Now it's free. We left the house in a daze, the morning light filtering through the trees as we made our way back to the car. I felt a strange mix of relief and sorrow, knowing that whatever had haunted me was finally at rest. But the memory of those eyes, of the whispers in the dark, would stay with me forever. As we drove away, I glanced back at the house one last time. In the rearview mirror, I saw a figure standing in the doorway, watching us. For a moment, I thought it was Margaret, smiling and free. But then the figure raised a hand, and I realized with a jolt of terror, it was the doll, its eyes wide open, staring straight at me. Story 6. The Watchers. I woke up to find my bedroom ceiling covered in writing that wasn't there before. It said, "They're watching you," in a handwriting that resembled my own. For a moment, I was convinced I was still dreaming. My name is Ethan, and I'm not the type to scare easily. But seeing those words, written in what looked like my own hand, sent a chill down my spine. I rubbed my eyes, hoping the writing would disappear. It didn't. The letters remained, a haunting declaration that felt like a direct violation of my personal space. I got out of bed and stared at the ceiling, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. How could someone have done this without waking me up? And why use my handwriting? I considered the possibility of a prank, but my apartment was secure, and I lived alone. My heart pounded in my chest as I ran through the possibilities. Sleepwalking? But I had never sleepwalked in my life. I needed answers, and I needed them fast. After a quick shower to clear my head, I grabbed my phone and snapped a picture of the writing. Maybe I could analyze it more later, or show it to someone who could help. I decided to talk to my neighbor, Mrs. Donovan, an elderly woman who had lived in the building for decades. She knew everything that happened here. She might have seen something. "Good morning, Ethan," she greeted me warmly as I knocked on her door. What brings you here so early? Morning, Mrs. Donovan. I was wondering if you saw or heard anything unusual last night. Someone might have entered my apartment. Her expression shifted from warmth to concern. No, dear. I didn't hear anything. Are you all right? I hesitated, then showed her the photo on my phone. This was on my ceiling when I woke up. She gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Oh my. Ethan, that's very disturbing. Are you sure it's your handwriting? It looks just like it, I replied, my voice trembling slightly. But I didn't write it. At least, I don't remember doing it. Mrs. Donovan looked around as if expecting someone to be listening. Ethan, I don't want to scare you, but strange things have happened in this building before. I've heard stories from other tenants about unexplained occurrences. Doors opening on their own, whispers in the night. This building has a history. Her words didn't do much to calm my nerves. What do you mean? What kind of history? She lowered her voice. There are rumors that this place is haunted. Some say it's the spirits of those who lived here long ago. Others think it's something more sinister. Whatever it is, it doesn't seem to like people living here. I thanked her and left, feeling more unnerved than before. Haunted? I didn't believe in ghosts. But as I walked back to my apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was indeed watching me. The day passed in a blur of paranoia. Every creak, every shadow seemed to hold a hidden menace. By the time night fell, I was exhausted but too afraid to sleep. As I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling where the message had been, I heard a soft whisper. Ethan. The voice was faint but unmistakable. It was coming from the corner of my room. My blood ran cold as I turned to look, my heart pounding in my chest. There was nothing there. I sat up, eyes wide in the darkness, waiting for something, anything to happen. Then, I saw it, a shadowy figure standing in the doorway, just beyond the reach of the moonlight. It moved slowly toward me, and as it did, the whispering grew louder. My breath caught in my throat as I realized the figure was saying the same words over and over, "They're watching you." Hey, subscribe for more scary stories. I bolted upright in bed, heart racing. The shadowy figure vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving me alone in the silence of my bedroom. The whispers had stopped, but their chilling echo lingered in my mind. I turned on the lights, hoping to chase away any remaining darkness. Sleep was impossible now. I spent the rest of the night with every light in my apartment on, pacing the floors, trying to convince myself it was just a nightmare. By dawn, exhaustion finally took over, and I dozed off on the couch. When I woke, sunlight streamed through the windows, momentarily easing my fear. But the memory of the shadow and the whispers was still vivid. I needed answers. I couldn't continue living in a state of perpetual fear. First, I decided to investigate the history of the building. If there were rumors, there had to be some truth to them. I made my way to the local library, hoping to find old records or newspaper clippings about the building. The librarian, a kind woman named Clara, was more than willing to help. She led me to the archives and left me with a stack of dusty old newspapers and documents. Hours passed as I sifted through them, uncovering a dark history I hadn't anticipated. The building had been constructed in the early 1900s and was originally a boarding house. It had changed ownership several times over the decades, each owner reporting strange occurrences. In the 1960s, there was a string of mysterious disappearances. Tenants vanished without a trace, and the authorities never found any leads. The place had earned a reputation for being cursed, but the stories faded over time as new residents moved in, oblivious to its past. Among the documents, I found a photograph of a man named Samuel Grady, one of the original owners. His stern face seemed to follow me, his eyes piercing through the yellowed paper. According to the records, he had been obsessed with the occult and conducted bizarre rituals in the basement. When he disappeared, rumors spread that he had summoned something he couldn't control. The tenants who vanished were said to be the result of his failed experiments. Armed with this unsettling knowledge, I returned home. The building's history explained a lot, but it didn't make me feel any safer. That night, I decided to confront whatever was haunting me. I set up a camera in my bedroom, hoping to capture evidence of the supernatural presence. If I could prove it was real, maybe I could find a way to stop it. As night fell, I felt the familiar sense of dread creeping in. I lay in bed, pretending to sleep, waiting for something to happen. Hours passed, and just as I was about to give up, I heard the whisper again. "Ethan." My heart pounded as I forced myself to stay still, listening. The whisper grew louder, closer, and then the shadow appeared, standing at the foot of my bed. I watched in horror as the shadow moved toward the camera. It reached out, and the camera flickered and died. The whispering stopped abruptly, and the room fell silent. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or even breathe. The shadow loomed over me, its presence suffocating. Then, in a voice that sounded like 1,000 whispers, it spoke. "Leave this place, or suffer their fate." The lights flickered violently, and the shadow vanished, leaving me gasping for breath. The fear was overwhelming, but I knew I couldn't stay. I had to leave, but not without understanding what I was dealing with. The next morning, I packed a bag and decided to stay at a friend's place for a few days. I couldn't stay in that apartment another night. Before leaving, I checked the camera footage. To my horror, it showed a dark, amorphous shape hovering over me, reaching toward the camera before it cut out. There was no mistaking it, something malevolent was indeed watching me. But where could I go? And more importantly, how could I escape something that had already claimed so many lives? I needed help, someone who understood the paranormal. And I knew just the person to call. I called an old friend, Jessica, who had always been interested in the paranormal. She had a knack for finding answers where others saw only darkness. She agreed to meet me that afternoon, her curiosity piqued by my strange experience. As I waited for her, I couldn't shake off the dread that had settled in my bones. The shadow, the whispers, the sense of being watched, it all seemed too real, too terrifying to ignore. Jessica arrived with a backpack full of equipment, her eyes wide with concern. "Ethan, what happened to you?" she asked, her voice filled with urgency. I led her to the living room, where I showed her the footage from the camera. She watched in silence, her expression growing more serious with every passing second. "This is intense," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We need to get to the bottom of this, and fast." We decided to visit the local historical society to dig deeper into the building's past. Jessica had a knack for finding hidden details, and together we combed through old records, journals, and photographs. The more we uncovered, the more disturbing the story became. Samuel Grady's obsession with the occult was well documented. His basement was rumored to be a place of dark rituals, where he sought to communicate with otherworldly beings. The disappearances in the 1960s seemed to be linked to his experiments. The missing tenants were never found, their fates sealed by the darkness he had summoned. As we pored over the documents, a faded photograph caught my eye, a picture of a young woman, her face etched with fear. Beneath it was a name, Emily Mills. According to the notes, Emily had been one of Samuel Grady's tenants and had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Her story was hauntingly similar to mine, with reports of strange noises, shadows, and whispers. Jessica's eyes widened as she read the details. "Ethan, I think you're dealing with the spirits of those who were trapped here by Samuel Grady's dark magic. They're trying to warn you, just like they were trying to warn Emily." We decided to visit the basement, the heart of Samuel Grady's sinister experiments. Armed with flashlights and an EVP recorder, we descended into the darkness. The air grew colder with each step, the musty smell of decay and old wood filling our nostrils. The basement was a maze of shadows, the walls covered in strange symbols and markings that looked like ancient runes. Jessica's EVP recorder crackled to life, and we both froze as a voice, faint and distorted, echoed through the speakers, "Leave now, while you still can." Fear gnawed at my insides, but I couldn't back down. I had to find out what was happening. As we moved deeper into the basement, we discovered a hidden door, its frame covered in cobwebs and dust. Jessica hesitated but then nodded, her determination matching mine. We pushed the door open, revealing a small, cramped room with a single, flickering light bulb hanging from the ceiling. On the walls were more symbols, and in the center of the room was an old, tattered book, its pages yellowed with age. Jessica picked up the book, her eyes scanning the cryptic text. "This is a spell book," she murmured. "These are the rituals Samuel Grady used. It's all here, the incantations, the symbols, everything." Her voice trembled with the weight of the discovery. "Ethan, we need to end this. We have to break the curse before it's too late." As the realization sank in, the room seemed to close in around us. The air grew heavier, and the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. "They're here," Jessica whispered, her voice barely audible over the noise. "They don't want us to leave. They don't want us to break the curse." Suddenly, the light bulb flickered and went out, plunging us into darkness. The whispers turned into screams, the shadows swirling around us like a living, breathing entity. I could feel their presence, cold and suffocating, pressing in on us from all sides. Jessica clung to my arm, her eyes wide with fear. "Ethan, we have to get out of here," she shouted, her voice breaking. But before we could move, a cold hand gripped my shoulder, and the darkness swallowed us whole. When I opened my eyes, I was back in my apartment, sprawled on the floor with Jessica beside me. The air felt thick with an unseen presence, and a chill ran down my spine. The basement, the shadows, the whispers, it all felt like a distant, terrifying dream, but the cold grip on my shoulder was a stark reminder that it was all too real. Jessica groaned and sat up, her eyes wide with fear. "Ethan, we need to end this. Now." I nodded, my resolve hardening. "We have to use the book," I said, my voice steady despite the fear gnawing at my insides. "We have to perform a counter-ritual, something to break the curse." Jessica and I quickly retrieved the book from where it had fallen and spread it open on the floor. The pages were filled with arcane symbols and cryptic instructions, but Jessica, with her knowledge of the occult, began to decipher them. "This is it," she said, pointing to a page covered in dark, foreboding symbols. "This ritual should sever the ties between this world and whatever Samuel Grady summoned. We need candles, salt, and a personal item from the original tenants, something to connect us to their spirits." We gathered what we could find, candles from my kitchen, salt from the pantry, and a necklace I had found in the basement, which we assumed belonged to one of the missing tenants. As we prepared the ritual, the atmosphere in the apartment grew increasingly oppressive. The whispers returned, louder and more menacing, as if they sensed what we were about to do. "They're trying to stop us," Jessica said, her voice shaking. "We have to hurry." We arranged the candles in a circle, poured the salt around them, and placed the necklace in the center. Jessica began to chant the incantation from the book, her voice steady and strong despite the rising terror. The room grew colder, and the shadows seemed to deepen, closing in around us. The candles flickered wildly, their flames struggling against an unseen force. I joined Jessica in the chant, our voices merging as we called upon whatever powers could aid us. The air crackled with energy, and the whispers turned into screams of rage and despair. The shadows swirled around us, a chaotic storm of darkness and malice. Just when I thought we might be overwhelmed, there was a blinding flash of light, and the shadows recoiled, retreating into the corners of the room. A figure materialized in the center of the circle, its form shifting and flickering like a mirage. It was Emily Mills, her face a mask of sorrow and pain. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the dying echoes of the ritual. "You've set us free." Her form began to fade, and with it, the oppressive presence that had haunted the apartment. Jessica and I collapsed to the floor, exhausted but relieved. The room felt lighter, the air clearer, as if a great weight had been lifted. "We did it," Jessica said, a faint smile on her lips. "We broke the curse." I nodded, but a sense of unease lingered. Something still didn't feel right. As we sat in the aftermath of the ritual, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had only scratched the surface of the darkness that had enveloped this place. Suddenly, the lights flickered again, and a cold breeze swept through the room. Jessica and I exchanged a terrified glance. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice trembling, "I think we missed something." Before I could respond, the apartment door slammed shut, and the whispers returned, louder and more insistent than ever. The shadows began to coalesce in the center of the room, forming a dark, malevolent shape. It was Samuel Grady, his eyes burning with hatred and rage. "You cannot escape me," he hissed, his voice a chilling blend of anger and despair. "This place is mine, and you will suffer as they did." Jessica screamed, and we scrambled to our feet, but it was too late. Grady's shadowy form surged forward, engulfing us in darkness. The last thing I heard was his malevolent laughter, echoing in my mind as everything went black. Story 7. The Cedar House Haunting. The decision to move into Cedar House was born out of necessity. The divorce had drained my finances, and this old, abandoned house was the best I could afford. Its reputation didn't bother me much. I didn't believe in ghosts. Besides, the idea of fixing up a place of my own was somewhat therapeutic. The house, with its creaky floorboards and peeling wallpaper, was an embodiment of a fresh start. However, from the moment I crossed the threshold, an unsettling chill crept into my bones. As I began unpacking, the sheer volume of forgotten belongings in the attic piqued my curiosity. Dust-covered trunks, old furniture, and an assortment of knickknacks lay scattered, telling tales of the previous owners. Among these, a weathered leather-bound diary caught my eye. It lay atop a pile of yellowing newspapers, its lock broken and pages brittle with age. My fingers tingled as I picked it up, the leather cold and worn. Settling on an old armchair, I opened the diary, revealing elegant, faded handwriting. The entries were mundane at first, recounting the daily life of Eleanor Smith, the former lady of the house. She described her family, their routines, and the occasional town gossip. But as I read on, the tone of the diary changed, growing darker with each entry. Eleanor's words became desperate, filled with fear and confusion. June 15th, 1924, something is wrong with this house. I hear noises at night, footsteps echoing in the attic. But when I check, there's nothing there. I fear I am losing my mind. A shiver ran down my spine. I glanced around the attic, half expecting to see a ghostly figure watching me. Shaking off the eerie feeling, I continued reading. The entries grew more frantic, Eleanor describing shadows that moved on their own and whispers in the dead of night. She wrote of sleepless nights and the dread that consumed her, culminating in a final, chilling entry. July 22nd, 1924, I cannot take it anymore. The footsteps are louder now, coming closer. I hear them even as I write this. There is no one else in the house. I am alone. But I am not alone. They are here with me. The diary ended abruptly, the last sentence trailing off into an ink blotch. My heart pounded in my chest as I closed the book, the air in the attic growing heavier. I felt a presence, an unseen weight pressing down on me. Every creak of the house seemed magnified, each sound a harbinger of something sinister lurking in the shadows. Unable to shake the growing unease, I decided to leave the attic and head back downstairs. As I turned to go, a soft thud echoed through the room, like a footfall. I froze, my breath hitching. Slowly, I turned around, scanning the dimly lit attic. Nothing. It was just my imagination, I told myself, gripping the diary tightly. I rushed downstairs, my heart still racing. The house felt different now, its once comforting silence now a source of dread. I had to find out more about Eleanor Smith and what happened to her. Maybe the town's records held some answers. But for now, I needed to calm down and convince myself that ghosts weren't real. As I placed the diary on the kitchen table, another noise echoed from above, a deliberate, echoing step. I spent the next day at the local library, determined to uncover the mystery of Eleanor Smith. The librarian, an elderly woman with sharp eyes and a curious nature, was more than willing to help once I mentioned the house. Cedar House, you say? It's been empty for years. Many believe it to be haunted. Strange things happen there, she murmured, leading me to a dusty archive room. We found old newspapers and town records, and as I pored over them, a tragic story began to unfold. Eleanor Smith had been a well-respected woman in the community, known for her kindness and grace. However, in the summer of 1924, her demeanor changed. Neighbors reported seeing her wandering the streets at odd hours, muttering to herself about shadows and whispers. The townsfolk whispered about her losing her sanity, but no one could explain the strange occurrences at Cedar House. Then, one day in late July, Eleanor disappeared without a trace. Her husband, who had been away on business, returned to find the house empty. A frantic search ensued, but Eleanor was never found. The official record listed her as missing, presumed dead. Her disappearance left a dark stain on Cedar House, and the property changed hands several times before being abandoned. Returning home with this new knowledge, I felt a mix of dread and determination. The diary had to hold more clues. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table, the diary open before me. As I flipped through the pages, I noticed something I had missed before: sketches in the margins. They were rough and frantic, depicting shadowy figures and indistinct faces. One drawing caught my eye, a figure standing at the top of the attic stairs, its face obscured by darkness. A sudden chill filled the room, and I heard a faint whisper, like a breath against my ear. "Get out," it seemed to say. My heart pounded as I scanned the empty kitchen, the shadows deepening with the setting sun. I shook my head, trying to dismiss it as my imagination running wild. But the feeling of being watched persisted, an oppressive weight that grew with each passing minute. Desperate for answers, I decided to spend the night in the attic. If Eleanor had documented her experiences, perhaps I could experience them too. Armed with a flashlight and a sense of resolve, I ascended the creaky stairs. The attic was colder than the rest of the house, the air thick with dust and something more, an intangible sense of dread. I set up a chair in the center of the room, the diary on my lap. The minutes dragged by, each creak of the house sending shivers down my spine. Hours passed with nothing but silence. Just as I was beginning to question my sanity, I heard it, a soft, deliberate footstep from the far corner of the attic. My flashlight beam trembled as I directed it towards the sound. The shadows seemed to shift and dance, but nothing was there. Suddenly, the temperature dropped further, my breath visible in the frigid air. The footsteps grew louder, closer, echoing in the confined space. Panic gripped me, but I stayed put, determined to uncover the truth. The attic door creaked open slowly, as if pushed by an unseen hand. My flashlight flickered and died, plunging me into darkness. In the pitch black, the footsteps stopped right in front of me. I could feel a presence, cold and malevolent, standing inches away. The air grew heavy, and a whisper, unmistakable this time, filled my ears: "Leave this place." My resolve shattered. I bolted from the attic, stumbling down the stairs. I fled the house, not stopping until I was outside, gasping for breath. The diary still clutched in my hand. I knew I couldn't abandon the house just yet. Eleanor's spirit was reaching out, and I had to find a way to help her, before it was too late. After my terrifying experience in the attic, I knew I couldn't stay in Cedar House alone. I reached out to my friend Laura, a local historian and a firm believer in the supernatural. Laura arrived the next morning, armed with a bundle of sage, a tape recorder, and a stack of old books. Her eyes sparkled with a mix of excitement and concern as she surveyed the house. "You weren't kidding," she said, running her fingers along the spine of the diary. "This place has a heavy energy. Let's see what we can uncover." We decided to conduct a seance in the attic that night, hoping to communicate with Eleanor's spirit. As the sun set, the house grew eerily quiet, the shadows lengthening with the fading light. Laura set up candles in a circle and instructed me to sit opposite her, the diary between us. We held hands, and Laura began to chant softly, invoking a protective circle. The temperature dropped again, and the air grew thick with tension. The flame of the candles flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls. A sudden, sharp knock echoed through the attic, followed by a soft, mournful wail. My heart pounded, but I squeezed Laura's hand, determined to see this through. "Eleanor, if you are here, please show us a sign," Laura called out, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. The attic remained silent for a moment, then a faint scratching sound filled the air. It grew louder, coming from the walls and the floor beneath us. The diary suddenly flew open, the pages flipping rapidly before stopping on an entry I hadn't read before. The words seemed to glow in the candlelight. July 21st, 1924, they are coming for me. I have seen their faces, dark and twisted. They whisper my name, urging me to join them. I am so frightened. If anyone finds this, please help me. I do not want to be one of them. The room grew colder, and I felt a presence pressing down on me. Laura gasped, her eyes wide with terror. We need to help her move on, she whispered. She's trapped here by whatever is haunting this house. We continued our seance, calling out to Eleanor and urging her to find peace. The scratching intensified, and the footsteps returned, pacing around us in a slow, deliberate circle. My breath hitched as I saw a shadowy figure materialize in the corner of the attic. It was tall and indistinct, its face a swirling mass of darkness. Eleanor, you are not alone, Laura cried out. We are here to help you. Show us how to free you from this place. The figure moved closer, its presence overwhelming. A cold hand brushed my cheek, and I felt a surge of despair so intense it nearly brought me to tears. The attic filled with whispers, a cacophony of voices blending into an indecipherable murmur. Then, a single word cut through the noise, clear and desperate, key. Laura and I exchanged glances, our fear momentarily eclipsed by determination. There must be a key somewhere, she said, her voice shaking. Something that can unlock whatever is binding Eleanor here. We spent the next few days searching every inch of the house, looking for anything that resembled a key. It was Laura who finally found it, hidden in a secret compartment behind an old portrait in the living room. The key was small and ornate, its surface etched with strange symbols. That night, we returned to the attic with the key in hand. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation, the air humming with unseen energy. As we held the key aloft, a sudden gust of wind extinguished the candles, plunging us into darkness. A soft, ghostly glow illuminated the attic, revealing Eleanor's spectral form standing before us. Her eyes were filled with gratitude and sorrow as she pointed to the far corner of the attic. We followed her gaze and found a small, locked chest buried under a pile of old blankets. With trembling hands, I inserted the key into the lock and turned it. The chest sprang open, revealing a collection of old letters and a locket. As I touched the locket, a wave of warmth spread through the room, and Eleanor's form grew brighter. Thank you, she whispered, her voice barely audible. You have freed me. The attic filled with light, and the oppressive presence lifted, replaced by a sense of peace. Eleanor's form dissolved into the light, and she was gone. But as the light faded, the shadows began to stir once more, hinting at an even darker force yet to be reckoned with. With Eleanor freed, I expected the oppressive atmosphere in Cedar House to lift entirely, but an uneasy tension remained. It was as if the very walls of the house were holding their breath, waiting for something. Laura and I sat in the kitchen, the locket and letters spread out before us. The old correspondence painted a picture of Eleanor's life, but there was one letter that stood out, its paper yellowed with age and its ink smeared as if written in a hurry. My dearest Eleanor, I fear the darkness that looms over our home. The entity that has attached itself to this place grows stronger each day. I can hear its whispers in the night, urging me to leave, but I cannot abandon you. I have hidden the key to its power in the attic. If anything happens to me, you must find it and destroy it. Only then will you be free. Forever yours, Thomas. Laura read the letter aloud, her voice trembling. Thomas knew about the entity. He tried to protect Eleanor, but he never got the chance to destroy it. A sudden, heavy thud echoed from the attic, shaking the house. The entity, no longer restrained by Eleanor's presence, was making itself known. Laura and I exchanged a look of grim determination. We had freed Eleanor, but our work was far from over. We armed ourselves with the essentials, salt, sage, and a couple of old iron rods, hoping these traditional protections would be enough. The climb to the attic felt like ascending into the heart of darkness itself. The air grew colder with each step, the shadows deepening unnaturally. As we reached the attic, a malevolent force seemed to press down on us. The darkness was so thick it felt almost tangible. We formed a protective circle with the salt, lighting the sage to purify the space. The entity's presence was palpable, a swirling mass of darkness that seemed to absorb the light from our candles. "Show yourself," Laura commanded, her voice echoing through the attic. The shadows coalesced into a towering figure, its form shifting and indistinct. Red eyes glowed from within the darkness, filled with malice and hunger. The entity let out a guttural growl, the sound reverberating through the room. It lunged at us, but the salt barrier held it back, its form recoiling as if struck. Laura began chanting an incantation, her words a mix of Latin and English, calling upon protective forces to aid us. The entity thrashed and screamed, the sound piercing my ears. It clawed at the barrier, its form growing more frantic. I grabbed the iron rod and, with a deep breath, stepped outside the circle. The entity turned its focus to me, its eyes burning with rage. I swung the rod, the iron slicing through the darkness, causing the entity to howl in pain. "Keep it distracted," Laura shouted, continuing her incantation. I swung again, each strike weakening the entity. The shadows began to dissipate, the entity's form flickering like a dying flame. But it wasn't enough. We needed something more, a final act to banish it completely. I remembered the locket, still in my pocket. Pulling it out, I held it up, the entity recoiling from its light. "Thomas's love protected Eleanor," I shouted. "Let it protect us now." The entity screamed, a sound of pure agony, as the locket's light grew brighter. The shadows writhed and twisted, the entity's form disintegrating into the air. With a final, ear-splitting shriek, the entity exploded into a cloud of darkness, which dissipated into the air. The attic fell silent, the oppressive weight lifting instantly. Laura and I collapsed to the floor, our breath coming in ragged gasps. We had done it. The darkness was gone, banished by the light of Thomas's love and our determination. As we sat in the aftermath, a sense of peace settled over Cedar House. The house, once a place of fear and torment, felt lighter, almost welcoming. We gathered the remnants of our tools and made our way downstairs, exhausted but victorious. A week later, I stood in the front yard, watching as the first rays of sunlight bathed Cedar House in a warm glow. The spirits had found their peace, and so had I. The house was no longer a place of darkness, but a beacon of hope and renewal. As I turned to leave, I felt a gentle breeze and heard a soft whisper in my ear, "Thank you." Smiling, I walked away from Cedar House, ready to start a new chapter of my life, free from the shadows of the past. The end. Subscribe for more true scary stories. Thanks for watching.